At 82 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of family drama imaginable. But nothing prepared me for what happened at that lawyer's office last Tuesday morning. When my daughter-in-law Sandra stood up during the will reading and heard those words, "She's the sole owner," the look on her face was worth every sleepless night I'd endured planning this moment. If you've ever been underestimated by your own family, if you've ever had someone try to manipulate you out of your own independence, this story is going to hit you right in the heart. Because sometimes the most powerful thing an elderly woman can do is remind everyone exactly who's still in charge. My name is Patricia Morrison, and this is the story of how I discovered that my own daughter-in-law had been systematically plotting to take control of my life, my home, and my financial future. And how I used the law itself to teach her a lesson she'll never forget. Let me start from the beginning, because you need to understand how we got to that moment in the lawyer's office. 15 years ago, when my son Michael married Sandra, I thought I was gaining a daughter. She was charming, articulate, and seemed genuinely fond of me. She'd call me Mom Patricia, with what I believed was real affection, and she made such an effort to include me in their lives. When Emma was born 2 years later, followed by Jake 3 years after that, Sandra was wonderful about making sure I had plenty of time with my grandchildren. But looking back now, I can see the signs that I missed. Even in those early years, Sandra had opinions about everything: how I decorated my house, what I spent money on, which doctors I should see. At the time, I interpreted this as caring involvement. She was young, enthusiastic, and full of energy. Robert, my husband of 54 years, used to joke that Sandra had enough opinions for the whole family. Robert was more perceptive than I was. "Patricia," he'd say after Sandra and Michael would leave, "that girl has a controlling streak a mile wide. She means well, but she thinks she knows what's best for everyone." I'd laugh it off because Sandra's suggestions usually seemed reasonable, and I appreciated that someone was paying attention to my welfare. The first real red flag came about 10 years ago, when Robert had his first heart attack. It was minor, thank God, but it scared all of us. Sandra immediately appointed herself as the coordinator of his recovery, researching cardiac diets, finding specialists, and even calling his doctors directly to get updates on his condition. At first, Robert and I were grateful for her help. Managing medical care can be overwhelming, especially when you're scared and stressed. But Sandra didn't stop at helping. She started making decisions without consulting us. She scheduled appointments with doctors we hadn't chosen, canceled appointments with doctors we trusted, and even filled prescriptions that Robert's primary physician hadn't authorized. When Robert tried to gently suggest that he preferred to handle his own medical decisions, Sandra became hurt and defensive. "I'm only trying to help, Dad Robert," she'd say with tears in her eyes. "I just want to make sure you're getting the best possible care. I've done so much research, and I found these specialists who are supposed to be the absolute best in the region." Robert, being the kind and gentle man he was, didn't want to hurt Sandra's feelings. So he went along with her choices, even when they meant driving 2 hours to see doctors who basically told him the same thing his local physician had already explained. Sandra seemed so invested in being helpful that neither of us had the heart to tell her she was being overwhelming. That pattern continued for years. Sandra would identify what she perceived as problems in our lives, research solutions extensively, and then present us with detailed plans for improvement. When we'd suggest that her solutions might not be necessary, she'd become emotional and remind us how much time and effort she'd put into helping us. It was a perfect manipulation, really. She made her controlling behavior look like loving concern, and she made any resistance to her control look like ingratitude or stubbornness. Robert and I found ourselves going along with Sandra's suggestions, not because we agreed with them, but because it was easier than dealing with the emotional drama that followed when we didn't. The dynamic got worse after Robert's second heart attack 5 years ago. This one was more serious, and he needed several weeks of recovery. Sandra immediately moved into our house to help with his care, bringing her own cleaning supplies, rearranging our kitchen for better efficiency, and creating detailed schedules for Robert's medications, meals, and activities. I'll admit that having help was initially a relief. Robert needed more attention than I could provide alone, and Sandra was genuinely knowledgeable about cardiac recovery. But she also took over completely. She answered our phone, managed our mail, and spoke to our friends and neighbors as if she were the lady of the house. When I tried to resume my normal routines, Sandra would gently but firmly redirect me. "Oh, Mom Patricia, don't worry about cooking dinner. I've already planned meals for the week based on Dad Robert's dietary restrictions. Why don't you just relax and spend time with him?" It sounded thoughtful, but the message was clear. Sandra was in charge now. After Robert recovered and Sandra moved back to her own house, she continued inserting herself into our daily lives. She'd call every morning to check on Robert's condition and suggest activities for his day. She'd stop by unannounced to bring us meals she'd prepared according to the cardiac diet plan she'd researched. She'd even call our doctors directly to ask about Robert's progress, claiming she was calling on our behalf. Robert started getting frustrated. "Patricia," he told me one evening, "I feel like I'm living in Sandra's science experiment. She's turned my heart attack into her personal research project, and I'm tired of being managed like a child." Too, but whenever Robert tried to assert more independence, Sandra would get tearful and remind him how scared she'd been when he was in the hospital. "I just can't bear the thought of something happening to you because we weren't being careful enough," she'd say. "I know I'm probably being overprotective, but I love you both so much." How do you argue with that? How do you tell someone who claims to love you that their love feels like a prison? The answer is, you don't argue with it. You go along with it year after year until you realize that you've given up more and more of your autonomy in the name of keeping peace with someone who's never satisfied with anything less than complete control. Robert's third and final heart attack came 3 years ago. He died at home, in his sleep, peacefully, which was exactly how he'd always said he wanted to go. The grief was devastating, but there was also a strange sense of relief that Robert had died on his own terms, not hooked up to machines in a hospital room managed by Sandra's research and scheduling. But if I thought Robert's death might give me some breathing room from Sandra's management, I was very wrong. Instead, his death seemed to trigger something in her that was even more controlling than before. The morning after Robert's funeral, Sandra appeared at my house with coffee, pastries, and a thick folder full of paperwork. "Mom Patricia," she said, settling herself at my kitchen table, "I know this is a difficult time, but we need to talk about your future. Robert isn't here to take care of you anymore, and Michael and I want to make sure you have all the support you need." I was exhausted, grieving, and emotionally vulnerable. Sandra's concern seemed genuine, and I was grateful that someone was thinking practically about the challenges I'd face as a widow. Robert had always handled our finances, insurance, and legal matters. I knew I'd need help figuring out how to manage everything alone. "I've been doing some research," Sandra continued, opening her folder. "And there are a lot of important decisions you'll need to make in the next few months. Decisions about insurance, about your living situation, about managing your assets. It can be really overwhelming for someone who's grieving, so Michael and I want to help you through this process." She spread papers across my table, brochures for financial advisors, information about estate planning, and printouts about aging in place versus transitioning to senior communities. Everything looked official and well-researched, which made Sandra seem knowledgeable and prepared. "The most important thing," Sandra explained, "is making sure all your assets are properly protected. Robert left you very well provided for, but managing everything alone can be complicated and stressful. There are tax implications, investment decisions, and legal requirements that most people don't understand." She pulled out more papers. "I've been researching financial advisors who specialize in working with widows. I've also found some excellent estate planning attorneys who can help make sure everything is structured properly for your protection." At the time, I thought Sandra was being incredibly thoughtful. She'd clearly spent hours researching options and preparing information for me. I was grateful that someone was thinking about practical matters while I was still struggling to get through each day without Robert. "What do you think I should do?" I asked. Sandra's eyes lit up. "Well, first, I think you should meet with this financial advisor I found. His name is David Chen, and he has excellent reviews for helping seniors protect their assets. He can review Robert's life insurance policies and help you understand how to manage the inheritance properly. She pulled out another brochure. I also think you should seriously consider your living situation. This house is so big for one person, and maintaining it alone could become overwhelming. I've researched some beautiful senior communities that would give you social interaction, activities, and professional maintenance services. My heart sank. The house Robert and I had shared for 37 years was my home. It was filled with our memories, our furniture, our life together. The idea of leaving it so soon after Robert's death felt like losing him all over again. Sandra, I said carefully, I appreciate your research, but I'm not ready to think about moving. This house is my home. Oh, of course, Sandra said quickly. I'm not suggesting you make any hasty decisions. I'm just saying that it's important to explore your options so you can make informed choices. You don't want to wait until you're struggling to maintain everything before you start looking at alternatives. That became Sandra's pattern over the following months. She'd present her research as information for my consideration, but she'd bring it up repeatedly until I agreed to at least look at whatever she'd found. She scheduled appointments with financial advisors, toured assisted living facilities, and researched home maintenance services, always presenting herself as my helpful daughter-in-law who was just trying to make sure I had good information. But the pressure was constant. Every conversation eventually turned to Sandra's concerns about my situation. Every family gathering included updates on new options she'd discovered for my consideration. Every phone call ended with suggestions about steps I should take to protect myself and plan for the future. The financial advisor Sandra had chosen, David Chen, turned out to be a commission-based salesman who wanted to move all my investments into products that would generate fees for him. When I asked questions about why his recommendations were better than the portfolio Robert and I had carefully built over decades, David's answers were vague and focused more on the benefits of professional management than on actual investment strategy. I left that meeting feeling confused and pressured. David had given me a thick packet of paperwork to review at home, and Sandra had scheduled a follow-up appointment before I'd even decided whether I wanted one. Mom, Patricia, Sandra said as we drove home from David's office, I know all this financial stuff is overwhelming. That's exactly why you need professional help managing it. David can handle all the complicated decisions so you don't have to worry about making mistakes. But I didn't want someone else making my financial decisions. Robert and I had been successful investors for decades. We understood our portfolio, we understood our risk tolerance, and we understood our goals. David's recommendations would have generated substantial fees for him while potentially reducing my long-term financial security. When I told Sandra that I wasn't comfortable with David's approach, she became frustrated. Mom, Patricia, you can't manage a complex investment portfolio by yourself. Robert handled all of this because he understood finance, but you've never had to make these kinds of decisions alone. Don't you think it would be safer to have professional guidance? The implication was clear. I wasn't smart enough or experienced enough to manage my own money. Sandra was suggesting that I needed professional supervision because I was incompetent to make my own financial decisions. That night, I called my longtime attorney, James Morrison. No relation, despite the shared surname. James had been Robert's college roommate and our family attorney for over 30 years. He'd handled our house purchases, our wills, and our estate planning. If anyone understood our financial situation, it was James. James, I said, I need some advice about financial planning. Sandra has been pressuring me to work with this advisor she found, but something doesn't feel right about his recommendations. Patricia, James said immediately, before you make any financial decisions, I think you should come in and review your current situation. Robert set up your estate planning very carefully, and you should understand exactly what you own and how it's structured before you make any changes. That conversation was the beginning of my education about just how much Robert had protected me and how much Sandra was trying to manipulate. The following week, I met with James at his office. He pulled out our estate planning files and walked me through everything Robert and I owned. What I learned was eye-opening. First, I was much wealthier than I'd realized. The house Robert and I had purchased in 1968 for $12,000 was now worth over $800,000. The rental property we'd bought in the 1980s was worth another $400,000 and generated steady monthly income. Our investment accounts, which Robert had managed conservatively but successfully, totaled more than $600,000. But the most important thing James explained was how Robert had structured our assets to protect me. "Patricia," James said, "Robert was very concerned about making sure you maintained complete control over your finances if you survived him. Everything is set up so that you're the sole owner of all assets, with complete authority to make decisions about them." "What does that mean exactly?" I asked. "It means that nobody else has any legal claim to your property or investments. You don't have joint ownership with Michael. You don't have any trusts that give other people authority over your assets, and you don't have any legal obligations to consult with anyone about financial decisions. Everything belongs to you, and only you can decide what to do with it." I felt a wave of relief. "So, I don't need to work with David Chen if I don't want to?" "Absolutely not," James said. "In fact, Patricia, I'd recommend being very cautious about anyone who pressures you to make major financial changes, especially if they're earning commissions from the products they're recommending." James pulled out another folder. "There's something else I want to discuss with you. Robert and I talked extensively about protecting your assets from potential manipulation, especially if family members became too involved in pressuring you about financial decisions." "What do you mean?" "Robert was concerned that after his death, well-meaning family members might try to convince you that you couldn't manage your affairs independently. He wanted to make sure you had legal protections that would prevent anyone from pressuring you into financial arrangements that weren't in your best interests." James explained that Robert had included specific provisions in my estate planning that would allow me to change beneficiaries if I felt that our intended heirs were manipulating me or trying to control my decisions for their own benefit. "Essentially," James said, "if Michael or Sandra or anyone else starts pressuring you about your assets in ways that make you uncomfortable, you have the legal authority to redirect your inheritance to other people. Grandchildren, other relatives, charities, whatever you decide is appropriate based on how you're being treated." I was amazed. Robert had anticipated exactly what was happening with Sandra, and he'd given me legal tools to protect myself. "James," I said, "Sandra has been pressuring me for months to sell my house, move to assisted living, and let financial advisors manage my investments. She presents it as concern for my welfare, but it feels more like she's trying to control my decisions." James nodded grimly. "That's exactly what Robert was worried about. Patricia, you should know that you're under no obligation to make any changes to your living situation or your financial management unless you want to. Anyone who's pressuring you to make major life changes for your protection may actually be more interested in gaining control over your assets." That meeting changed my perspective completely. I realized that Sandra's constant pressure wasn't loving concern. It was manipulation designed to make me dependent on her guidance and control. But I decided not to confront Sandra immediately. Instead, I wanted to see how far she'd push her manipulation if I continued to resist her suggestions politely. The answer was, she'd push much, much further. Over the following months, Sandra escalated her pressure campaign significantly. When gentle suggestions didn't work, she started using more aggressive tactics. She began involving Michael more directly, having him call me to express his concerns about my stubbornness regarding financial planning and living arrangements. She started bringing Emma and Jake to our conversations, having them ask innocent questions like, "Grandma, wouldn't you be lonely living in such a big house all by yourself?" Most manipulatively, Sandra started scheduling appointments for me without asking permission first. She'd call me to say she'd found a wonderful financial advisor who had agreed to meet with me, or she'd announce that she'd arranged tours of assisted living communities that she thought I'd find interesting. When I'd object that I hadn't asked for these appointments, Sandra would become hurt and defensive. "Mom, Patricia, I'm just trying to help you explore your options. You don't have to commit to anything, but don't you think it's important to be well informed about your choices?" The pressure became relentless. Sandra would call me multiple times a week to discuss new options she'd researched, new concerns she had about my situation, and new reasons why I should seriously consider making changes to my living arrangements and financial management. She also started making subtle threats about my access to Emma and Jake. If I seemed resistant to her suggestions, Sandra would mention how busy their schedules were getting, or how much homework they had, or how they were becoming more interested in spending time with their friends than with their grandmother. The implication was clear. If I didn't cooperate with Sandra's plans, she might limit my access to my grandchildren. That's when I knew Sandra had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Using children as leverage in adult conflicts is emotional abuse, and I wasn't going to tolerate it. I called James and asked him to schedule a meeting where Sandra and Michael would learn exactly where they stood legally regarding my assets and my decisions. "Patricia," James said, "are you sure you want to do this? Once we have this conversation, there's no going back. Sandra and Michael will understand that they have no legal authority over your assets, and they'll know that you're aware of their manipulation attempts." "I'm sure," I said. "Sandra needs to understand that she can't manipulate me, threaten me, or use my grandchildren as bargaining chips. It's time for some consequences." James scheduled the meeting for the following Tuesday. He sent official letters to both Michael and Sandra, requesting their presence at his office for a comprehensive review of Patricia Morrison's estate planning and asset management. The formal tone of the letter was intentional. James wanted Sandra and Michael to think this was the meeting where they'd finally learn about my financial situation and potentially gain some influence over my decisions. I didn't sleep much the night before the meeting. Part of me hoped that somehow Sandra would surprise me, that she'd show genuine concern for my welfare rather than just trying to gain control over my assets. But I knew what I was likely to see, and I was prepared for it. James's office is in one of those old downtown buildings with high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and leather-bound law books that make everything feel very official and serious. When Michael and Sandra arrived that Tuesday morning, Sandra was practically vibrating with anticipation. She dressed up in her best business suit and carried a leather portfolio that undoubtedly contained all her research about my properties and financial management. "Good morning, Mom," Michael said, giving me a hug. He seemed nervous, but Sandra looked like she was about to win the lottery. James began with the usual legal formalities, explaining that we were there to review the current status of my estate planning and to clarify any questions about asset ownership, decision-making authority, and inheritance provisions. Sandra leaned forward in her chair, clearly eager to finally learn the details about my financial situation that she'd been researching and speculating about for months. "Before we begin discussing specifics," James said, looking directly at Sandra, "I want to make sure everyone in this room understands the current legal status of Patricia Morrison's assets. There seems to be some confusion about ownership structures and decision-making authority that needs to be clarified." Sandra's eyes lit up. This was the moment she'd been working toward for months. "Actually," Sandra interjected, clearly unable to contain her enthusiasm, "Michael and I have done quite a bit of research about Mom Patricia's situation over the past year. We've identified some really excellent opportunities for asset protection and management that would benefit everyone involved." She opened her portfolio and started pulling out documents. "We found some wonderful assisted living communities that would be perfect for her social and safety needs, and we've gotten preliminary appraisals on both properties that show excellent market values for investment diversification." She spread her papers across James's conference table as if she were making a business presentation. "We've also identified several financial advisors who specialize in senior asset management, and we've researched the tax implications of various estate planning strategies that could maximize the long-term value of the family assets." I watched Sandra's performance with a mixture of amazement and disgust. She was talking about my life, my home, and my financial security as if they were business assets that she had the authority to manage and optimize. "We understand that Patricia might be emotionally attached to maintaining her current living situation," Sandra continued. but we want to make sure that emotional considerations don't prevent her from making the smartest financial and practical decisions for her future security. James let Sandra finish her presentation before responding. When she finally stopped talking and looked at him expectantly, he opened his file and pulled out a thick stack of official documents. "Sandra," James said in his measured attorney voice, "I appreciate your thoroughness in researching these various options. However, you seem to be operating under some fundamental misunderstandings about Patricia's legal situation and decision-making authority." The confidence started to drain from Sandra's face. "I'm sorry. What do you mean?" James spread his own documents across the table. "Patricia Morrison is the sole legal owner of all assets in question. The family residence, the rental property, all investment accounts, all bank accounts, and all other financial holdings belong exclusively to her. There are no co-owners, no joint accounts, no existing trusts, and no legal arrangements that would give anyone else authority over these assets or decisions about them." Sandra's mouth actually fell open. But surely when Robert passed away, there were joint ownership arrangements that— "When Robert Morrison passed away," James continued, "all jointly held assets transferred directly to Patricia as the surviving spouse, exactly as specified in their estate planning documents. She became the complete and sole owner of all property and financial assets, with full legal authority to make any decisions she chooses about them." I was watching Sandra's face go through what looked like the 5 stages of grief in fast forward. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, all flickering across her features as she processed what James was telling her. "Okay," Sandra said, clearly struggling to maintain her composure. "But obviously Patricia wants to make sure these assets are properly protected and managed for the benefit of the whole family. That's exactly why Michael and I have been helping her explore her options for professional financial management and appropriate living arrangements that would—" "Sandra," I said quietly, speaking for the first time since we'd sat down, "I need you to stop talking and listen very carefully to what James is about to explain to you about my legal situation." James looked at his documents again. "Patricia Morrison has complete and unrestricted legal authority to dispose of her assets in any manner she chooses, at any time, for any reason. She can sell them, gift them, donate them to charity, or bequeath them to anyone she selects. No other person has any legal claim, expectation, or authority regarding these assets." You could have heard a pin drop in that office. The air conditioning hummed, and somewhere down the hall, a phone was ringing, but our conference room was completely silent. "Furthermore," James continued, "Patricia's current estate planning documents specify that upon her death, her assets will be distributed according to her wishes as outlined in her will and trust arrangements. However, she retains the absolute right to modify these arrangements at any time, for any reason, without consultation or approval from anyone else." Sandra was starting to look genuinely distressed. I don't understand. We've been helping her plan for her future. We've been trying to make sure she's protected and taken care of properly." "Have you?" I asked. "Or have you been trying to position yourselves to gain control over assets that don't belong to you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Michael looked confused, glancing back and forth between his wife and me like he was watching a tennis match where he didn't understand the rules. "Mom," he said finally, "I think there might be some kind of misunderstanding here. Sandra and I have only been trying to help you manage the stress and complexity of handling everything alone after Dad died." "Michael," I said, turning to look directly at my son, "in the past 18 months since your father died, how many times has Sandra suggested that I should sell my house?" He thought for a moment, clearly trying to remember specific conversations. "Well, she's mentioned that it might be easier for you to live somewhere with less maintenance responsibility." "How many times?" I repeated, my voice firm. I don't know exactly. Several times, I guess. 23 times, I said. I've been keeping a record. 23 separate occasions where Sandra has pressured me to sell the house where your father and I built our life together, where you grew up, where your children loved to visit their grandmother. Sandra's face was turning red. Patricia, I was only thinking about your best interests and your safety. A house that size requires a lot of maintenance and upkeep that might become overwhelming for someone your age living alone. And the rental property? I continued, not letting Sandra deflect. How many times have you suggested that I should sell that? Sandra fell silent, clearly realizing that I had been keeping track of her manipulation attempts. 18 times, I answered for her. 18 separate occasions where you've told me that managing rental property is too stressful and too complicated for someone my age, despite the fact that I have a property management company that handles all the day-to-day operations, and despite the fact that the rental income provides me with financial security and independence. James cleared his throat diplomatically. Patricia, would you like me to explain to Michael and Sandra the specific provisions of your current estate planning? Yes, I said. I think it's time they understood exactly how their behavior over the past 18 months has influenced my decisions about the future distribution of my assets. James opened another folder and pulled out several official documents. Patricia Morrison's current will and trust arrangements specify that upon her death, her primary residence will be left to her granddaughter, Emma Morrison, to be held in a trust managed by independent trustees until Emma reaches the age of 25. The color drained completely from Sandra's face. The rental property, James continued, will be left to her grandson, Jake Morrison, also to be held in trust with independent management until Jake reaches 25. The proceeds from the sale of both properties, if the beneficiaries choose to sell, will be used to fund educational expenses and provide financial security for both grandchildren. Sandra looked like she was going to faint. What about Michael? What about your son? Michael, James read from the documents, will inherit his father's personal belongings, the family photographs and memorabilia, and a cash bequest of $50,000. The remainder of Patricia's financial assets, including all investment accounts and savings, will be divided equally between 3 charitable organizations: the American Heart Association, the local food bank, and a scholarship fund for first-generation college students. Michael looked stunned. Mom, I had no idea you were planning. Planning what, Michael? Planning to leave my assets to people who love me for who I am, rather than to people who seem more interested in controlling my property than in supporting my independence? Sandra suddenly stood up from her chair, her composure completely shattered. This is insane. Patricia, you're making an enormous mistake. Michael is your son, your only child. How can you leave virtually everything to grandchildren who are barely teenagers and to charities instead of to your own family? Because, I said calmly, Emma and Jake love me unconditionally. They visit me because they enjoy spending time with their grandmother, not because they're calculating the future value of my real estate. They support my independence and respect my decisions, rather than constantly pressuring me to make changes that would benefit them financially. James interjected smoothly. Of course, Patricia wants everyone to understand that these estate planning arrangements can be modified at any time if circumstances change or if family relationships develop in ways that demonstrate different priorities and motivations. I looked directly at Sandra. The door isn't completely closed, Sandra. But it would require a dramatic and sustained change in behavior and attitude. Sandra sat back down heavily, her hands shaking. I was trying to help. I thought you needed assistance and guidance managing everything after Robert died. I spent so much time researching options and trying to find the best solutions for your situation. No, I said firmly. You spent so much time researching ways to convince me that I was incompetent to manage my own life and positioning yourself and Michael to gain control over my assets. There's a fundamental difference between helping someone and manipulating them. Michael finally spoke up, his voice quiet and uncertain. Mom, I swear I didn't understand that Sandra was pressuring you. I thought we were being helpful and supportive during a difficult transition. Michael, I said, Your wife has spent 18 months systematically undermining my confidence in my own decision-making abilities. She's scheduled appointments with financial advisors without my permission. She's toured assisted living facilities and presented me with contracts to sign. She's brought real estate agents to my house to appraise my property without asking me first. She's researched estate planning attorneys and tried to convince me to restructure my assets according to her recommendations. I pulled out my own folder, a detailed record I'd been keeping of Sandra's manipulation attempts. She's used emotional manipulation, claiming that her controlling behavior was motivated by love and concern. She's used guilt, suggesting that my resistance to her suggestions was ungrateful and stubborn. And most recently, she's used subtle threats about limiting my access to Emma and Jake if I don't cooperate with her plans. Michael looked at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of shock, disappointment, and growing understanding. "Sandra, is this true? Have you been pressuring Mom and threatening to keep the kids away from her?" Sandra's final mask of reasonable concern finally slipped completely. "Your mother is 82 years old, Michael. She shouldn't be making major financial decisions without family input. She shouldn't be living alone in that enormous house, trying to manage rental property and investment accounts like she's still 30 years old. What if something happens to her? What if she gets confused or makes terrible choices? What if someone else takes advantage of her?" "Someone like you?" I asked. The question hit Sandra like a physical blow. The room went completely silent, except for the sound of Sandra's rapid breathing. "I think," James said diplomatically, "this might be an appropriate time to take a short break and allow everyone to process the information we've discussed." But Sandra wasn't finished. "Fine. You want to leave everything to your grandchildren and to charity? Go ahead. But don't expect Michael and me to keep pretending that everything is normal. Don't expect us to keep bringing Emma and Jake around to visit. Don't expect us to keep including you in family holidays and celebrations." The mask hadn't just slipped. It had been ripped off and thrown on the floor. "Sandra," I said very quietly, "are you explicitly threatening to prevent me from seeing my grandchildren because I won't give you control over my financial assets?" Even Michael looked horrified. "Sandra, what are you saying? You can't use the kids as leverage in this argument." "I'm saying," Sandra snapped, clearly beyond caring how her words sounded, "that Patricia has made her priorities very clear. She's chosen money and control over family relationships, and now she can live with the consequences of that choice." James was writing furiously in his legal pad. "Sandra, I want to make sure I'm documenting your statements accurately. You're saying that Patricia's access to her grandchildren is contingent upon her making financial decisions that meet with your approval? That family relationships in your household are conditional upon inheritance expectations?" Sandra realized she'd revealed too much, but it was too late to take back her words. I didn't mean it like that." "Actually," I said, "I think you meant it exactly like that, and I think this conversation has been incredibly educational for everyone in this room." I turned to Michael, my heart breaking for my son who was finally seeing his wife's true nature. "Michael, your wife just threatened to weaponize your children against their grandmother because I won't let her control my money and my life. I want you to think very carefully about what kind of person does that and what kind of marriage you're in." Michael looked like he was going to be sick. "Mom, Sandra, we need to have a serious conversation about this." "Oh no," Sandra said, her voice rising. "Don't you dare take her side against me. I've spent months trying to help your mother make sensible decisions about her future, and this is how she repays us? By cutting us out of her will and making us look like villains?" "You made yourselves look like villains," I replied calmly. "I didn't have to do anything except listen to your own words and observe your own actions." James closed his files with a decisive snap. "I believe we have all the information we need for today's meeting. Patricia, if you would like to make any modifications to your estate planning based on today's discussion, we can schedule follow-up appointments as needed. Michael, Sandra, if you have questions about the legal aspects of anything we've covered, I'd recommend consulting with your own attorney." As we prepared to leave the office, Sandra made one final, desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "Patricia, please, can't we just forget about all this and start over? Can't we go back to being a normal family and put this whole misunderstanding behind us?" I looked at her for a long moment, seeing clearly for the first time the manipulative, controlling person she'd always been underneath her mask of loving concern. "Sandra," I said, "family isn't something you turn on and off based on whether you're getting what you want from people. Family relationships aren't business transactions where love and access are made conditional upon financial compliance. If you genuinely want to be part of this family, you need to understand that it means caring about people for who they are as human beings, not for what you can extract from them financially." I turned to Michael. "And you, son, need to decide whether you're going to be a husband and father who protects his children from being used as emotional weapons, or whether you're going to continue being Sandra's accomplice in manipulating your own mother. Because what happened here today showed me that either you were completely oblivious to your wife's systematic manipulation, or you were knowingly complicit in it. Either way, we have some very serious rebuilding to do in our relationship." The drive home from James's office was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I felt emotionally drained, but also strangely liberated. For 18 months, I'd been questioning whether I was being paranoid, unfair, or unreasonably resistant to Sandra's suggestions. But her explosive reaction in that conference room had confirmed everything I'd suspected about her true motivations. Sandra wasn't concerned about my welfare. She was frustrated that her manipulation campaign had failed to achieve its goal of giving her control over my assets. That evening, I sat in the living room that Robert and I had furnished together 37 years ago, surrounded by the memories and belongings that Sandra had been so eager for me to abandon. The house felt peaceful in a way it hadn't for months. The constant pressure, the endless suggestions, the guilt-inducing conversations about my situation, all of it had been lifted from my shoulders. My phone rang around 8 o'clock. It was Michael, calling without Sandra. "Mom," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I owe you an enormous apology, a huge, heartfelt apology. I had no idea how aggressively Sandra had been pressuring you about your living situation and your finances. I thought she was just being helpful and supportive, but after listening to everything you said today, and after thinking about all the conversations we've had over the past year, I can see how it must have felt like constant manipulation and control." "Michael," I said gently, "I love you. You're my son, and that will never change, regardless of what happens between Sandra and me. But I need you to understand that your wife crossed some very serious boundaries. She wasn't trying to help me. She was trying to systematically undermine my confidence in my own abilities so that I would become dependent on her guidance and decision-making." "I know," he said quietly. "We had a very long, very difficult conversation after we left the lawyer's office. Sandra admitted that she'd been overly focused on the financial aspects of your situation. She said she was worried about the inheritance, about Emma and Jake's future financial security, about what would happen if you needed expensive medical care and there wasn't enough money left. And how do you feel about her admissions?" Michael was quiet for several moments. "Honestly, Mom, I feel ashamed. I feel like I failed as a son. I feel like I let my wife manipulate and pressure my own mother, and I feel like I didn't protect you from behavior that I should have recognized as harmful." I could hear the genuine remorse in his voice, which gave me some hope that our relationship could be repaired. "Dad always told me that my job was to take care of you after he was gone," Michael continued. "And instead, I let Sandra make you feel threatened and controlled in your own home. I let her use our kids as leverage against you. I let her turn your grief and vulnerability into an opportunity for manipulation." "Michael," I said, "relationships can be rebuilt if both people are willing to do the honest work of acknowledging what went wrong and committing to different behavior. But Sandra needs to understand that she can't treat family members like obstacles to overcome or resources to manage for her own benefit." "What would it take?" Michael asked. "What would Sandra need to do to earn back your trust and respect?" I had been thinking about this question all afternoon. First, she needs to acknowledge that her behavior was manipulative and harmful, not just overly focused on financial considerations. She needs to take full responsibility for the pressure campaign she waged against me, without minimizing it or justifying it as loving concern. Okay, what else? Second, she needs to completely stop making any suggestions about my living situation, my property, my financial decisions, or my care arrangements. Those topics are completely off-limits, unless I specifically ask for input, which I probably won't. That seems reasonable. Third, she needs to demonstrate over time that she values our relationship independently of any inheritance expectations. She needs to show that she's interested in spending time with me because she enjoys my company, not because she's positioning herself for future financial benefit. And if she can do those things consistently, if she can do those things genuinely and consistently over a sustained period, then we can begin to rebuild trust between us. But Michael, I will not tolerate any return to the manipulation, pressure, or threats that characterized her behavior over the past 18 months. And I absolutely will not tolerate anyone using my grandchildren as emotional leverage ever again. What about the will? Michael asked. What about leaving most of the assets to Emma and Jake instead of to our family? That depends entirely on whether your family can demonstrate that you're motivated by love and genuine concern for my well-being, rather than by expectations about inheritance. The estate planning that James read today reflects how I felt after 18 months of constant pressure and manipulation. But wills aren't carved in stone. They can be modified based on changing circumstances and evolving relationships. Over the following weeks, I watched carefully to see how Sandra and Michael would respond to this new reality, where they understood they had no legal claim to my assets and no authority over my decisions. At first, Sandra tried a completely different approach. She called me frequently with overly sweet, apologetic phone calls where she expressed regret for any misunderstandings that might have occurred and suggested that we put all this unpleasantness behind us and return to being a normal family. But her apologies were carefully worded to focus on my interpretation of her actions rather than on the actions themselves. She was sorry that I had felt pressured rather than sorry for pressuring me. She regretted that her helpful suggestions had been misunderstood rather than acknowledging that her suggestions had been inappropriate attempts at control. It was a classic manipulation technique, apologizing for the victim's reaction while avoiding responsibility for the harmful behavior that caused the reaction. When those surface-level apologies didn't immediately restore our relationship, Sandra tried escalating to more dramatic gestures. She sent me elaborate flower arrangements with cards expressing her deep love and appreciation for me. She had Emma and Jake create handmade cards telling me how much they missed their grandmother. Most manipulatively, Sandra started posting nostalgic photos on social media of family gatherings and holidays, with captions about how much she treasured our beautiful family and how grateful she was for all the love and wisdom Mom Patricia has shared with us over the years. These public displays were clearly designed to create social pressure for me to reconcile with Sandra. Friends and neighbors who saw her posts began asking me why I seemed to be having problems with such a devoted daughter-in-law who obviously cares so much about our family relationship. But I wasn't interested in public relations campaigns or surface-level reconciliation. I wanted to see evidence of genuine understanding and behavior change, not performative demonstrations of affection. It took nearly a month before Sandra offered a real apology. She came to my house alone one afternoon, which was unusual because she typically brought Michael or the children as emotional buffers for our conversations. This time, she sat in my living room and finally said the words I had been waiting to hear. "Patricia," she began, "I need to apologize to you, and I need to do it honestly without making excuses or trying to justify my behavior." That opening was more promising than anything she'd said in weeks. "I was manipulative," she continued. "I was controlling, and I was trying to pressure you into making decisions that would benefit Michael and me financially rather than decisions that were truly in your best interests." I spent months undermining your confidence and independence because I wanted to gain influence over your assets and your living situation. She took a shaky breath. I told myself that I was motivated by concern for your welfare, but the truth is that I was motivated by fear about our financial future and greed about the inheritance. I wanted to make sure that Michael and I would benefit from your assets, and I was willing to manipulate you to achieve that goal. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was honest and specific in ways that her previous attempts had not been. I also need to apologize for threatening to limit your access to Emma and Jake, Sandra continued. That was cruel and manipulative, and it was wrong to use your love for your grandchildren as leverage against you. Children should never be weaponized in adult conflicts, and I'm ashamed that I stooped to that level. Sandra, I said, I appreciate this apology because it acknowledges the reality of what happened between us rather than trying to minimize or justify your behavior. But I need you to understand that rebuilding trust after this level of manipulation is going to take considerable time and consistent demonstration of change. I understand, she said, and I understand if you don't want to modify your will. I understand if you think Emma and Jake would be better stewards of your assets than Michael and me. Maybe we don't deserve your trust or your inheritance. That admission actually surprised me. For the first time in our relationship, Sandra seemed to be thinking about what was best for the family rather than what was best for Sandra. What I want, I told her, is to have relationships with my family members that are based on mutual love and respect, not on financial calculations or inheritance expectations. If we can build that kind of authentic relationship over time, then we can discuss the future. But it has to be genuine, and it has to be sustained, and it can't be motivated by trying to influence my estate planning. Sandra nodded. I want that too. I want Emma and Jake to have a relationship with their grandmother that isn't complicated by my mistakes and my greed. I want Michael to be proud of the wife he married instead of ashamed of my behavior toward his mother. That conversation marked the beginning of a very gradual rebuilding process. Sandra kept her promise about backing away from any discussions of my finances, my living situation, or my care planning. When she came to visit, she focused on spending time together rather than on researching solutions to problems I didn't have. Michael also worked actively to repair our relationship. He started calling me more frequently just to chat about everyday topics, not to discuss logistics or express concerns about my situation. He became more attentive to signs that Sandra might be slipping back into controlling patterns, and he was more willing to speak up when conversations seemed to be heading in manipulative directions. Most importantly, both Michael and Sandra made efforts to ensure that my relationship with Emma and Jake remained separate from any adult conflicts about finances or inheritance. The children continued visiting regularly, and their interactions with me felt natural and affectionate rather than strategically orchestrated. But I also remained vigilant. Trust, once broken through systematic manipulation, doesn't heal overnight. I continued documenting any concerning behaviors, and I maintained regular communication with James about my estate planning and asset protection. 6 months after that confrontation in James's office, I had another private meeting with him to review my situation and consider potential modifications to my will. Patricia, James said, how do you feel about the changes you've seen in Sandra and Michael's behavior? I'm cautiously optimistic, I replied. Sandra has kept her promises about not pressuring me regarding financial decisions or living arrangements. Michael has been more attentive to preventing manipulation and more focused on rebuilding our relationship based on mutual respect rather than inheritance expectations. And Emma and Jake? My relationships with my grandchildren seem to have returned to normal. They visit because they enjoy spending time with me, not because they're being coached to influence my decisions. They seem happier and more relaxed during our visits, which suggests that the adult conflict was affecting them more than I realized. James pulled out my current will. Would you like to make any modifications based on these improved circumstances? I had been thinking about this question for weeks. I want to make some changes that reflect the progress we've made, but I also want to maintain protections that would allow me to respond if the manipulation begins again. James nodded. What kind of modifications are you considering? I want to increase Michael's inheritance significantly, but I want it structured in a way that rewards continued respectful behavior rather than creating entitlement. I want to establish educational trusts for Emma and Jake that provide for their college expenses and graduate school if they choose, but I don't want them to receive large sums of money at young ages. I paused to consider my next words carefully. I also want to maintain the charitable bequests, because supporting causes I care about has become important to me. But I want to reduce the charitable percentages so that more assets go to family members who demonstrate that they value our relationships for the right reasons. James began making notes. What kind of behavioral provisions would you want included? I want Michael's inheritance to be contingent upon maintaining respectful, non-manipulative relationships with me. If there's any return to the pressure tactics, manipulation, or threats that characterized Sandra's previous behavior, I want the legal authority to redirect those assets. That's definitely something we can structure, James said. What about Sandra specifically? I thought about this carefully. Sandra isn't my biological relative, so she wouldn't typically inherit from me directly. But I want to include provisions that could benefit her indirectly if she maintains the behavioral changes she's made. For example, Michael's inheritance could be structured to benefit their family if their marriage remains stable and respectful. James and I spent the next hour crafting estate planning modifications that reflected both the progress that had been made and the protections I still needed. The new will increased Michael's inheritance substantially while maintaining safeguards against future manipulation. It established robust educational trusts for Emma and Jake while ensuring they wouldn't receive life-changing amounts of money before they were mature enough to handle it responsibly. Most importantly, it included clear provisions that would allow me to modify beneficiaries if family relationships returned to patterns of manipulation, control, or emotional abuse. When I left James's office that day, I felt more secure and optimistic about my family relationships than I had in years. The crisis had been painful, but it had also clarified everyone's motivations and established healthier boundaries. Aliás, estou curioso para saber de qual cidade e país você está acompanhando essa história. Escreva nos comentários. Over the following year, the improvements in our family dynamics continued and deepened. Sandra maintained her commitment to respecting my independence and autonomy. Michael became more confident in setting boundaries with his wife when her controlling tendencies occasionally surfaced in other areas of their lives. Emma and Jake, now 17 and 14, seemed to benefit from the improved family atmosphere. Emma began talking to me more openly about her college plans and her goals for the future. Jake started sharing his interests in sports and music without seeming worried about saying the wrong thing. Most tellingly, both grandchildren began asking thoughtful questions about Robert's life, our marriage, and our experiences building a life together. They seemed genuinely interested in understanding their family history and learning from their grandparents' experiences. The rental property that Sandra had once been so eager for me to sell became a source of pride for Emma. She expressed interest in learning about real estate investment and property management as potential career paths. Jake became fascinated with the financial planning strategies that Robert and I had used to build our wealth over decades of careful saving and investing. These conversations reminded me why I had originally wanted to leave substantial assets to my grandchildren. They were approaching their inheritance as an opportunity to learn, grow, and build on our family's financial foundation rather than as money they were entitled to spend freely. Sandra noticed these conversations and, to her credit, encouraged them rather than trying to redirect Emma and Jake's focus toward more immediate gratification. She seemed to understand that their grandmother's financial wisdom was a valuable educational resource rather than a threat to her parental authority. The real test of our rebuilt relationships came during the holidays that year. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt genuinely excited about hosting Christmas dinner in my own home, rather than feeling pressured to consider other arrangements for my safety and convenience. Sandra helped with cooking and preparation, but she asked what I wanted her to contribute rather than taking over my kitchen and redesigning my menu. Michael focused on spending quality time with everyone rather than expressing concern about my ability to handle the logistics of hosting. Emma and Jake seemed genuinely happy to be celebrating in their grandparents' house, surrounded by the decorations and traditions that Robert and I had established over decades of holidays together. During dinner, Emma raised her glass and made a toast that brought tears to my eyes. "I want to toast Grandma Patricia," she said, "for showing all of us what it means to stand up for yourself and demand respect from the people who claim to love you. You taught us that it's possible to be generous and loving while still maintaining your boundaries and your independence." Jake added, "And for keeping our family house so that we can keep making memories here together." Even Sandra seemed genuinely moved by the grandchildren's words. "Patricia," she said, "I want to add my thanks for being patient enough to give us a chance to learn how to be better family members. You could have given up on us after the way I behaved, but you gave us the opportunity to earn back your trust." Michael raised his own glass. "To Mom, for teaching us the difference between helping someone and controlling someone, and for showing us that love without respect isn't really love at all." That Christmas felt like the true resolution of our family crisis. Not because everything was perfect, but because everyone seemed to understand their role in creating a healthier family dynamic. Sandra continued to occasionally slip into controlling patterns with Michael and the children, but she had learned to recognize these behaviors and correct them before they escalated into major conflicts. Michael had become more confident in addressing his wife's controlling tendencies directly rather than enabling them through passive agreement. Most importantly, everyone seemed to understand that our family relationships were ongoing commitments that required consistent effort and mutual respect rather than entitlements based on biology or legal connections. The following spring, James and I made one final modification to my estate planning. Based on 2 years of sustained behavioral improvement, I restructured my will to more equitably balance family inheritances with charitable giving. Michael would now inherit the house and a substantial portion of my financial assets, with provisions ensuring that Sandra would benefit indirectly through their marriage and their children's security. Emma and Jake would receive significant educational trusts and smaller direct inheritances when they reached 25. The charitable giving remained substantial, but no longer represented the majority of my assets. I had learned that using my will primarily as a punishment mechanism wasn't healthy for anyone involved. But the behavioral provisions remained in place. If manipulation, control, or emotional abuse returned to our family relationships, I retained the legal authority to redirect inheritances toward people and causes that better reflected my values. I never had to use those provisions. Sandra and Michael maintained the respectful, supportive relationship we had rebuilt, and Emma and Jake continued to approach their future inheritances with maturity and gratitude rather than entitlement. 3 years after that confrontation in James's office, I can honestly say that our family crisis, as painful as it was, ultimately made us stronger and healthier. Sandra learned that love cannot be separated from respect. Michael learned that being a good son means protecting his mother from manipulation rather than enabling it. Emma and Jake learned that family wealth is a responsibility to be stewarded rather than a prize to be claimed. And I learned that setting boundaries, even with family members, isn't cruel. It's essential for maintaining relationships based on genuine love rather than fear, guilt, or financial calculation. If you're reading this and you recognize patterns of manipulation or control in your own family relationships, I want you to know that it's never too late to establish healthier boundaries. It's never too late to demand respect from the people who claim to love you. And it's never too late to distinguish between people who care about your well-being and people who care about what you can provide for them. Most importantly, remember that you have the legal right to make decisions about your own life, your own assets, and your own living arrangements, regardless of what other people think is best for you. Family members who truly love you will support your autonomy and independence. Family members who try to undermine your confidence and control your decisions are revealing their true motivations. At 85 now, I'm still living independently in the house that Robert and I built our life in. I'm still managing my own finances with James's guidance. I'm still making my own decisions about my daily life, my social activities, and my future planning. Sandra occasionally makes helpful suggestions about home maintenance or medical care, but she respects my right to accept or decline her input. Michael calls regularly to check on my well-being, but he doesn't pressure me to make changes unless I ask for his advice. Emma is now in college, studying business and real estate, with her education fully funded by the trust Robert and I established for her. Jake is a senior in high school, planning to study music and finance, with similar educational security waiting for him. Our family gatherings are relaxed and enjoyable, rather than tense negotiations about my situation. We focus on enjoying each other's company rather than managing my supposed limitations. And every time I walk into my living room and see the family photos spanning decades of holidays, birthdays, and celebrations, I'm reminded that I made the right choice in fighting for my independence and demanding respect from the people I love. That day in James's office, when Sandra stood up and heard the words, "She's the sole owner," was a turning point not just in our legal understanding, but in our family dynamics. It was the moment when everyone learned that loving someone doesn't give you the right to control them, and being family doesn't exempt you from treating each other with dignity and respect. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to refuse to enable their worst behaviors. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give people is the opportunity to learn how to love you better. And sometimes, when you're 82 years old and people assume you've become vulnerable and controllable, the most powerful thing you can do is remind everyone that you're still very much in charge of your own life. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt pressured by family members who claim to have your best interests at heart, or if you know someone who might benefit from hearing about the importance of maintaining independence and setting boundaries, please share this with them. Like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about real people navigating complex family relationships with courage, wisdom, and dignity. Remember, you're never too old to stand up for yourself, and it's never too late to demand the respect you deserve.